We're going to be talking about the big fat surprise. Dave Murphy got me started on that last week, and he got started on it because of an article from JACC, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It's about saturated fat. He and Nina Teicholz and I had a little conversation on this last week, and I recorded a video on it. I'm going to go through the gory details. And again, it gets gory. You know, this whole issue, that what's the top diet for humans? As you know, I mean, I tend to get nervous when I start traipsing into that territory. It's like that old statement that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Food epidemiology is one of those areas. It's a very dangerous area for, quote, experts. It's very muddy. It's unclear. It's a mess. It reminds me of the quote. You know, some people would say the quote comes from Otto von Bismarck. Others would say, I always heard it came from Mark Twain. I heard that he said, those that respect the law and love sausage should watch neither one of them being made. What has that got to do with this? I'm going to drag you through the gory details, the failure, some of the frustration associated with the question of saturated fats in the diet. We're going to talk about that. And again, hopefully you won't end up with the headache that I have just from getting started on that. So that's today's feature, saturated fats, good or bad. Again, Dave Murphy got us started on this last week. Actually, he sent me the JACC article a couple of weeks ago. What are we talking about? The big fat surprise. That's the title of a book. It was written by Nina Teicholz. We'll talk about the book in just a minute. That came out like 4 years ago. You know, it's so interesting. As humans, we're so slow to learn really important stuff. You remember with this whole pandemic, the pandemic had been predicted many times. Osterholm, I think it's Michael Osterholm, wrote the book, The Most Dangerous Enemy, something like that. I read that book. I've covered it in a couple of videos. And he said, look, the coronaviruses are likely to create a significant pandemic because of some of the demographics, some of the habits around food and stuff. It's likely to come from China, and we did nothing to prepare for it. Same thing's going on with saturated fat. There's still a huge debate. Most people think saturated fat is really, really bad for you, despite continuing evidence to the contrary. Yes, I said it, and I expect a lot of haters to pile on because of that comment. The evidence is piling up on saturated fat, and we're going to go over it today. Now, why did it come back up? This book came out, I think it was 4 years ago. We'll find out in the next slide. Will remind me. Here's why. And it's because, again, Dave Murphy responded to this article from JACC, Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations, a JACC state-of-the-art review. So just to give you a tiny little teaser, at the end, we'll cover some of the basics on that state-of-the-art review. It's not that they're just case studies. They're not case reviews. There are full-blown randomized clinical trials out there, a lot of them. And now there are even meta-analyses of those critical trials, randomized clinical trials. You can't get more powerful than combinations of randomized clinical trials and meta-analyses of those. So we'll talk about those when we get a little bit closer to the end. As I said, any food epidemiology, whether you're talking about and vegan versus carnivore, low carb, paleo, keto, a lot of pain, a lot of emotion, and a lot of pain coming from the emotion, and a lot of heartfelt beliefs. But the science, the epidemiology, is pretty confusing. And again, I'm going to carry you through some of the things that we've seen in the past and lead up to the JACC article a week and a half ago. Asking whether saturated fat is good or bad for cardiovascular health is looking for a simplified answer to a complicated issue. Dietary saturated fats believed to increase blood levels of LDL cholesterol. And a lot of people would say, does that really matter? We'll get into that. Subsequent risk for coronary artery disease. Since the 60s, dietary guidelines emphasized a reduction in consuming saturated fat. 2 old studies showing direct correlation. Hugh and Associates, 1997, in the New England Journal. Again, this is not a bad journal, one of the top 2 or 3 in the world for medicine. Quote, replacing saturated and trans-unsaturated fats with unhydrogenated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats is more effective in preventing coronary heart disease in women than reducing overall fat intake. And there you see the title of the article over on the right side. McGee and Associates in 1984 in the American Journal of Epidemiology, quote, men who developed coronary heart disease also had a higher mean intake of percentage of calories from protein, fat, and saturated fatty acids, SFAs, and polyunsaturated fatty acids than men who remained free of coronary heart disease. Newer studies are challenging this, though. Chowdhury and Associates in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Again, another quote, high levels of saturated fat intake had no effect on coronary disease. Monounsaturated, alpha-linoleic, and omega-6 were found to have no association with disease. Siri, Torino and Associates, 2010, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Quote, during 5 to 23 years of follow-up of over 1/3 subjects, 11,000 developed coronary heart disease or stroke. Intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or CVD. D'Souza and Associates, 2015, British Medical Journal. Saturated fat intake was not associated with all-cause mortality, CVD mortality, total CHD, ischemic stroke, type 2 diabetes. There was no convincing lack of association between saturated fat and CHD mortality. Schwingschakel and Hoffman, 2014, British Medical Journal Open. No significant risk of reduction could be observed considering all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality and other combined types of endpoints. Saturated fat is not a single entity. It's biologically complicated, and when you begin to understand what saturated fats are and how the biochemistry geeks look at different components of saturated fats, you begin to wonder, how and why did they link all these things up? SFA, saturated fats, are saturated because they have no double bonds between the carbon atoms of the fatty acid chain. You see the carbon atoms here. All fats are made up of fatty acids. So this is stearic acid with 18 carbons, oleic acid with 18 carbons. It's monounsaturated because it's got a double bond right here. No double bonds in stearic acid, so it's a saturated fat. Linoleic has C18, but it's got 2 double bonds here and here. You begin to see the differences between these polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. Saturated, no double bonds. Monounsaturated, 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated, 2 or more double bonds between carbon atoms. That's what those things mean. Monounsaturated fatty acids, MUFAs, have 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated PUFAs, PUFAs, have 2 or more double bonds. So good sources for monounsaturated are fats and oils like canola, olive, and sunflower, nuts and nut butters, peanuts, avocados, olives, sesame seeds, and tahini. It's said that different SFAs, saturated fatty acids, vary in their effects on lipid levels. For example, stearic acid is generally excluded as it's considered not a cholesterol-raising saturated fat. Dariush Muzaffarian, Dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts in Boston, said in an interview with Medscape, the U.S. view on saturated fats is totally based on the effects on LDL-C, LDL cholesterol. And that's why they have dietary guidelines to lower our saturated fat intake and why stearic acid is given a free pass. They don't affect just LDL cholesterol. They affect particle size, and they affect HDL cholesterol and triglycerides. It's not clear which ones are better or worse if you begin to look at all of those different effects. And for those of us who say, you know what, we're not clear how much the impacts on cholesterol are a big deal compared to bigger issues, that contributes to another major driver of this confusion around saturated fats. Marion Nestle, professor of nutrition, food studies, and public health at NYU, told Medscape, saturated fat raises LDL-C in comparison to the effects of unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. All fat foods, without exceptions, are mixtures of the three kinds of fatty acids: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So it's not surprising that the effects of foods and diets can differ. The source of saturated fat matters, at least according to a lot of folks. What you replace saturated fat with also matters, again, according to a lot of folks. Now look at the Mesa study. Higher intake of dietary SFAs was associated with lower cardiovascular risk, whereas a higher intake of meat SFA was associated with greater CVD risk. And here's the link, and here's the Mesa multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. Very, very well-known study. That specific SFA was a side part of that study. And again, you get these large studies like Mesa, you get a lot of offshoots of many studies that were done. Sometimes they create more confusion than they clear up. But again, it was a very productive study, created a lot of information, much of which we're still sifting through. The second bullet, a pooled analysis of 11 prospective studies of more than 1/3 healthy adults older than 35 suggests that consuming polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated fat lowers the risk for coronary artery disease, whereas replacing saturated fat with carbohydrates may increase the risk. Well, I think for most of the viewers of the channel, at least that second piece, replacing saturated fats with carbs, increasing the risk, makes a lot of sense. Now, the polyunsaturated versus saturated, again, don't overreact immediately. Continue to watch the preponderance of the evidence as it develops. The EPIC trial, another one of those large studies like the Mesa trial, the EPIC trial conducted in almost 500,000 middle-aged adults from 10 countries found that processed meats were linked to cardiovascular mortality, but not red meat per se. More confusion. And confusion leads to frustration. Now, a lot of people would say, and I agree somewhat with this, stop emphasizing macronutrients, fats, carbs, and protein, and instead highlight real foods. I think there's reality to that. However, I do think there's a place. As I look at the overall risk components of the patient population that I see and the middle-aged population, given the problems associated with and the prevalence associated with prediabetes, I think number one, you need to make sure that you know whether you have prediabetes or full-blown diabetes. And then number two, if you cannot metabolize carbs, be careful about the sources and the types, and then most of all, the amount of carbs in your diet. It's not usually sugars that tend to cause the major problems, nearly so much as it is grains, breads, pastas. Astrup and Associates in JACC, June 2020. Although SFAs increase LDL-Cs in most individuals, this is not due to increasing levels of small, dense LDLs, but rather larger LDLs, which are much less strongly related to cardiovascular risk. We're going to go deeper into that study, the Astrup study. Whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, and dark chocolate are SFA-rich foods with a complex matrix and are not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. We'll repeat that again a little bit later in a different context. Alpha-linoleic polyphenols and omega-3 fatty acids present in nuts, olive oil, vegetables, oily fish rapidly attenuate inflammation and coronary thrombosis. We've got a link for that. Nutraceuticals and antithrombotic agents. The Mediterranean diet, a big following for that diet. In comparison to a, quote, low-fat diet, energy unrestricted Mediterranean diet with 41% fat, supplemented with at least 4 tablespoons of olive oil or a handful of nuts. The PrevMed study, you may remember that. We've got a couple of videos on it. Achieved a 30% risk reduction in over 7,500 high-risk patients. These high-risk patients, you need to go back and look. This is not a statement that you just go to the Mediterranean diet. If you are your typical high-risk patient, going to the Mediterranean diet is an improvement. The Mediterranean diet, however, as you will see, has a significant number of carbs. And if you already know that you cannot digest carbs, then again, you can do better. Now, it's not just diet, obviously, it's lifestyle, and folks have to look at an overall lifestyle. A small study, single aerobic exercise session appeared to counteract the postprandial endothelial dysfunction induced by some diets. Diet is one factor that helps heart disease. It is by far the biggest. Not so much the diet and the macronutrients, but the amount of food that you eat. In other words, the body fat content. Body fat in and of itself, it's not an inert energy storage tissue. Obviously, brisk walking, exercise, high intensity intervals, stress release, appropriate sleep, all of those are very important. So let's get back to the big fat surprise and JACC's new take on that. As I said, it was a book written by Nina Teicholz. It was 2014, not 4 years ago, 6 years ago. The subtitle is Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. It was a New York Times bestseller in 2014. It's a tome, it's long. Again, I did a few comments about it in several videos. I just retaped or re-recorded a video which goes into some of these details. 497 pages of details about the science, details about the history of this project, the personalities and the politics and the money that went into turning this into policy. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. It won a lot of book awards: The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Kirkus Reviews, Forbes. Let's Eat by Barron's, Gene Epstein. The author skillfully recounts the tragicomic tale of how it's been possible for an ostensibly science-based culture to be so out to lunch about the food that we eat. You get his little pun there, out to lunch. Sort of like my pun about people that like sausage shouldn't watch it being made. People that like science about diet shouldn't watch it being made either. British Medical Journal. It's impressive. The book shook me. Teicholz has done a remarkable job in analyzing the weak science, strong personalities, vested interests, and political expediency. Mona Sharon, to eat or not to eat? That's the question these days. And for the past 4 decades, people have been told not to eat red meat because they're high in saturated fat. Washington Monthly, a remarkable new book, fascinating, detailed, highly readable, investigative history of how some of America's most trusted scientific institutions went off the rails. This next quote is one of my favorites because it comes from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it describes the arrogance that a lot of the professionals put into this place. We've all been arrogant. I've had my episodes specifically about this issue. I was low fat for decades and low saturated fat. This book should be read by every nutritional science professional as a guide to risks of hubris or hubris, depending on how you pronounce it, and to the consequences of basing public policy on belief as opposed to evidence of positive beneficial effects. All scientists should read as an example of how limited science can become federal policy. Teicholz compiled a historical treatise on how scientific belief versus evidence, non-government organizations, food manufacturers, government agencies, and moneyed interests promised more than they could deliver, and in the process, quite possibly contributed to the current worldwide obesity epidemic, and I'll add, and to the deaths and destruction and disability that have gone with it. So a big deal. The book's a big deal. So why haven't we responded to it? Well, there's been some response, but again, we'll talk about how much response. Here's a couple of quotes out of the JACC article, the article that came out this week, or 2 weeks, a week and a half ago, on the 20th. Here's a quote: recommendation to limit dietary saturated fatty acid has persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary. And here's one of the things I would say editorial-wise. You know, back 30 years ago when a lot of this was happening, the science was not that clear. The science is improving and the public policy is following it. But again, if you read that book, you get a clear understanding. People reported and put facts and science out there that just were not facts or science. If that's the first time you've ever heard of that, where have you been? Another quote from the JACC article: most recent meta-analyses of randomized clinical trials found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fatty acids on cardiovascular disease. Third quote, we've mentioned this before, although SFAs do increase LDL, it's not the small dense LDL, which are more associated with danger. It's the larger LDL, which are much less strongly related to disease. So the conclusions were, again, quotes, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, egg, and dark chocolate are SFA rich. They're not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The final quote, the totality of available evidence does not support further limiting of the intake of such foods. So that's the story. What are the authorities saying now in terms of public policy? Well, if you live in the UK, the big authority there is the NHS, the National Health Services. And if you go to the NHS website, they start telling you how to eat less saturated fat. How about the American Heart Association? If you live here in the US, saturated fat, what do they say? Well, there's a lot of conflicting information. And should I eat them or not? If you can see my cursor, decades of sound science has proven it can raise your, quote, bad cholesterol, or, quote, bad, end quote, cholesterol, and put you at higher risk for heart disease. So we've got a significant disconnect in terms of the science. You got the highest level of science just being quoted in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association still saying it's bad.
There's nothing like a community. We saw that in the Louisville event. People got together and started talking about how they've had challenges and successes in preventing their own heart attack, stroke, or chronic disease. It became very clear that you don't have to be a doc with a full-time 30-year career in preventive medicine to understand this and successfully prevent heart attack, stroke, the number one killer and disablers of people. You don't have to be a physician to prevent eye disease, kidney disease. All you have to do is think, listen, and become part of the community. Now, how do you do that? Go to the membership login on our webpage, and as you can see, you can get right in. You have to sign up if you haven't signed up already. And I've already signed up. I've already gone in. It's very simple, very easy to understand. In order to help encourage this, after the success and the positive emotion, the positive impact that we're seeing with these events, we're saying, look, we need to offer more of these services for free in order to help grow this community. So you'll see us starting to do drawings for the webinar event, the courses. We've got a book coming out in about a month. We'll be offering that. Even full-blown evaluations, providing those for free for folks that, again, help us grow the community. So if you'd like to find out what the most recent rules are for the most recent drawing, just come to the membership page. Thank you for your interest.